Well, thank you. Great to see lots of old friends. General Sullivan, thank you always for your kind words. Thank you for the chance to come back here. I see lots of people in the audience who I have worked with closely over the last 3 years, who I don't see as much as I used to now that I am up near the Secretary of Defense as the Acting Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness. But a great chance to be back here today. I am grateful that you would make the time to come see me, to be part of this, because we are all, I know, united by a love of and concern about the United States Army. So, good morning. It is, as I said, an honor for me to come back to this podium today for the second time at that. As General Sullivan said, when I was here last year, 1 year ago, I was the newly sworn-in Undersecretary of the Army. I would be remiss this morning if I didn't take such a public occasion to state what I feel and have expressed many times quite privately. It has been a great honor for me to serve alongside Secretary of the Army John McHugh, who, as you know, recently announced that he would be stepping down in the fall. He and I both served in Congress a long time ago now for me, although he was a senior member from the opposite party when I was brand new and very, very young. I admired him then from afar, and my time with Secretary McHugh in the Army has only reinforced that distant impression. He has, for me, been a model of judiciousness, wisdom, and personal elegance. I consider him a great friend as well as a colleague. We, those of us who care about the Army, those of us in the Army, will miss him. We will really miss him dearly. This is a time of great transition in the Army, not least of all because of Secretary McHugh's retirement. We will soon have a new Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, who comes to Washington, D.C. from Fort Bragg. And on a more trivial note, as has already been foreshadowed, I spend most of my time these days in the role as Acting Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness, a job that Secretary Ash Carter asked that I assume. I am still, technically, at least for the moment, the Undersecretary of the Army, but my mind is at OSD, even if my heart remains here in the Army, where I started 3 years ago, first as General Counsel and then as Undersecretary. Nevertheless, this morning I should note that the interests of OSD and the Army are not, well, always in opposition, despite what I might used to think about that. It is really in both roles that I want to speak to you today to talk about what I am doing at PNR and how it will affect and involve the Army. Last year, some of you were here, I am sure, I posed 10 questions for the Army. Those dealt with issues like PPBE and its antique processes, what the replacement to R4Gen might look like, whether the Army's force planning should be threat-based or capability-informed, and similar such matters. In a nod to the past, I would like to do something similar this year, posing not 10 questions, but a mere 7 additional questions for the United States Army. Questions which I don't myself presume to have all the answers, but which I offer up for your consideration and honestly, and hopefully, your insight too. These arise from my leadership on behalf of Secretary Carter on what has become known as Force of the Future. In one of his first acts as Defense Secretary, Dr. Carter went to his old high school in Pennsylvania, and he delivered an address which outlined his vision for a 21st century Defense Department, a force of the future. Not simply talking there about the military, but also, and quite importantly, about the civilian workforce that is so important to our national security. He noted in that talk that there were young men and women in today's military, and those who might contemplate joining it, who have grown up with technology. It is native to them. He also observed that the terrible events of September 11th had brought forth an outpouring of service, an outpouring that might, he speculated, recede as the destruction of the Twin Towers faded into memory. He questioned a military structure with roots in what he called the Napoleonic era. And he called for promotions based on merit and talent, not merely on temporal benchmarks. Everything that I have been working on over the last 2 months since I assumed this new role has been an outgrowth of that powerful and provocative address. Today, more than 100 people stand with me in OSD, the Joint Staff, across all of the services, in identifying problems with the current personnel system and ways to reform it. We have every federally funded research and development center fired up to model, to offer analytical support. The importance of the work has brought together an amazing team, not only from within OSD or the Department of Defense, but from across all of government, and some from without, from the private sector too, to midwife force of the future into being. Later today, I will be attending the first war game, yes, war game, involving personnel, the first one that DoD has ever put together on such a matter. It is called Talent Leap 2015. And experts from across the country have descended onto Washington to be part of this. The Secretary has given me until August 19th to deliver him a plan that is fully coordinated with the services, so time is of the essence, to say the least. I have promised him revolutionary change, and I hope not to fail him. For it is my belief, it is my fervent belief, that the current personnel system, which has satisfactorily served us for 75 years now, has become outdated. And what once worked for us has now, in the 21st century, become unnecessarily inflexible, inefficient, and inequitable. So it's in the context of this all-consuming project that I ask of you a few questions that I myself am grappling with, about which I have no firm conclusions, but to which I spend days and many long nights thinking about and working on. Let me start at the start, accessions. Now, I have General McConville here at the front, and he and I work closely on these issues. And I should say at the outset, it is an amazing thing for me, not surprising, but an amazing thing to see that the Army of all the services has thought more about these questions, is working on them furiously. So it is meant as no criticism, but rather simply a statement of the challenges before us when I say we still have much work to do. But let me start with accessions. My first question is whether we should accept in the Army the waste, the inefficiency in Army recruiting. Let me digress on that for just a moment. I would ask for your brief indulgence on this. Recruiting is one of the most important jobs in the Army, in all of the services. It's a very difficult task. Each year into the active component of the Army, we assess anywhere from 60,000 to 80,000 young men and women, depending on the needs of the force. These young men and women must be special people. They must be what the Army operating concept calls for, and I want to use its words now, resilient and fit. They must be soldiers of character. They must be competent, committed, agile, and adaptive. They must be capable of forming cohesive teams of trusted professionals, all the while representing the diversity of America. A tall order. And meeting these requirements has proven to be no mean feat. Given the epidemic of obesity, the requirement set by Congress and by DoD that effectively requires a high school degree before you can be accessed into the armed forces, and the sad prevalence of drug abuse and petty criminal activity, it's estimated that each year less than 400,000 young people become eligible for military service. And across all of the services, more than 250,000 of that 400,000 cohort, nearly 60%, are needed to meet our mission. That includes both active and reserve components. To meet this tough challenge, a very tough challenge, the Army spends billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. And it is, as I said, tough to do. And the statistics reveal this. This past year, Army recruiters have averaged 10 contracts per year, less than one per month. The numbers are quite similar in terms of productivity for the Navy and the Marine Corps, although the average Air Force recruiter somehow inexplicably manages almost 45 contracts a year, almost 5 times the output of recruiters in other services. But more interesting and of deeper concern to me is that the Army makes 16 million contacts a year. This is the result of various forms of marketing, in the hopes of, again this year, writing 68,000 contracts. That's not too great a batting average, but for me, the real problem is still deeper. And that is in realizing that of those 68,000 contracts, it is estimated that 40% will not complete their first term of enlistment, and more than 20% will not even make it to their first duty station. That's expensive, very expensive, both in the crude terms of dollars and in the inestimably valuable currency of human potential. In this case, lost, if not forever wasted. It raises the question, is there a better way to do this? We have made several personnel management changes in recent years, including reducing the number of conduct waivers, increasing the number of so-called Tier 1 enlistees. But despite these changes, the needle on first-term attrition has not substantially moved. My second question, and I shall be briefer here, is whether we should accept that the Army, and all of the services for that matter, are becoming a family business. 83% of recruits have a family member who served in the military, 83%. 33% had a family member who retired from the military. 36% of recruits across all military departments had a father who served in some branch of the military. And perhaps most astonishingly, 6% of recruits had a mother who served in the military. Looking at direct lineage in the service, nearly 20% of young Army officers are the children of soldiers. Needless to say, this level of military service in no way reflects the broader society in which we live. And indeed, while the familial aspect of this is in some ways quite noble, it does suggest that the full diversity of America's brilliant mosaic is not being captured by the United States military in any branch of service. My third question is, should we accept that in the Army, 50% of female officers attrit after their initial commitment is completed? Women make up 22% of the officers in the Army today, not nearly enough, especially as women now predominate in higher education, and the need for knowledge workers in the Army and other services is only going to grow over time. But to lose half at the first opportunity is something that just cannot stand. And what is really a sweeping and devastating indictment, we really don't know why so many women leave the Army. No service does exit interviews with departing men or women. So all we can offer up is really cocktail party speculation about a matter that should demand the most serious of inquiries. My fourth question. Should we accept that the more we invest in an officer, the less likely that he or she is going to be serving in the United States Army after 10 years? Great officers can come from any commissioning source. I myself am a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, a fine school. But it is a fact that we spend the most time and money on cadets at the United States Military Academy. We select rigorously for admission. We evaluate constantly. We cull where necessary. A substantial investment is also spent on four-year ROTC scholarship students. Less investment is made in 2- and 3-year ROTC scholarship students, and those often prior enlisted who enter the officer corps through OCS, less today than a few years ago. So given this tiering of initial investments, what are the respective retention rates from these various commissioning sources? The opposite of what one would hope. Of year group 2004, those who have now served 10 years on active duty, only 38% of West Point graduates remain on active duty, just more than a third. 43% of four-year ROTC students remain on active duty, while 55% of non-scholarship or 2-year scholarship ROTC students are on active duty. In other words, those officers in whom we make the most investment, in which we spend the most time, are the most likely to leave the Army. My fifth question deals with advanced civil schooling. Should we accept that the percentage of general officers with degrees from civilian institutions has markedly declined over the last 20 years? Should we care that the number of Army general officers with doctorates can be counted on two hands? There are 7 today. Should we be concerned that the Navy, a smaller service, has twice that number, or that the number in both of the services has fallen by 50% over just the last 5 years? In 1995, nearly 60% of brigadier generals in the Army had a graduate degree from a civilian academic institution. Today, that number is less than 40%. Nearly 50% of separating colonels and lieutenant colonels have a fully funded graduate degree from a civilian institution. 50%, while less than 30% of general officers have this designation, suggesting that to receive a fully funded graduate degree from a civilian institution is to prejudice your chances of promotion to general officer rank. My 6th question is, should we accept that many of the most interesting and seemingly most useful broadening experiences do little, seemingly, to enhance promotion opportunities? For example, programs like the Secretary of Defense Corporate Fellows. The SecDef Corporate Fellows Program, which brings in top quality officers from across all the services to work with industry titans, ranging from Google to Pepsi to Union Pacific, from high tech to old school, has produced 20 general officers over the course of its run. No surprise, really, given that those officers selected for the Corporate Fellows Program are seen as high flyers. 20 general officers, but the Army can claim none of them. The Air Force has dibs on 15 of the 20 general officers who spring from the SecDef Corporate Fellows Program. It is worth asking ourselves why that is so. My 6th question is whether we should accept the churn through jobs that is characteristic of the current personnel system and the requirements that it sets. Let's start at the top. In America, the average Fortune 500 CEO has a tenure of 7 years. Chief of Staff of the Army gets 4, and sometimes not even that. It gets worse as you go into other C-suite offices, if you will. The chief HR officer at a Fortune 500 company has a tenure of 4 years. Yet the average tenure of the G1 over the last 25 years, General McConville's important job, has been but 2 years. So too with comparisons between the CIO at the corporate level and the G6, or the CFO and the G8. Both Army staff principals have, on average, half the tenure of their corporate analog. And the churn is even greater at lower levels. In most of the Army staff offices, more than 50% of the staff turns over every single year. In 3 years, the whole organization is a new one. And since we're talking about the chief HR officer, something I do care a lot about, may I ask, who is this person for the United States Army? Is it Lieutenant General McConville, the G1? Is it the Assistant Secretary of the Army, Deborah Wada? Both able public servants, to be sure. But what about education? This is human capital we're talking about, after all. That's General Perkins down at TRADOC, and Lieutenant General Bob Brown at the Combined Arms Center, and then all of those centers of excellence. We pride ourselves in the Army on managing people, but we don't have a consolidated HR function at all. My 7th question turns to the civilian workforce. Should we accept the cumbersome processes that define civilian HR, that make HR in the Pentagon seem more like a tedious exercise in compliance rather than a strategic exercise of the highest priority? What if I told you that the Department of Defense has the authority to bring on 2,500 highly qualified experts from outside government to close critical gaps in knowledge, talent, and expertise? Yet due to the complex patchwork of hiring authorities, we have, across the entire building, only 91. What if I told you that when we send recruiters to college campuses to seek out fresh talent we need for cyber, STEM, other technical fields. We don't have the authority to hire them on the spot. That is not a problem they have at Google, Apple, or McKinsey. And would you believe it if I told you that we have more than 66 systems, 66 for human resource IT in the department? You don't believe that? You shouldn't, because we have 66 systems just for pay. All the HR IT systems added together top out at nearly 10 times that, more than 600 different ones, costing the Department of Defense almost $2 billion annually. This is 870% more per full-time employee than the next costliest commercial entity. Would you believe that the average age of our civilian interns, our interns in the U.S. Army, is nearly 40 years old? Hard to believe, but true it is. I said sincerely at the outset that I don't have solutions to all of these problems, these personnel conundrums. I don't. But I am working on them, because in my gut, I don't believe that in these 7 cases, these 7 questions, which are just illustrative of what is to me an ineffective personnel system writ large, I don't believe that the answer to any of the questions I have posed to you today is yes. Yes, we should accept these things. I instead say the opposite. And I say this not out of political belief or mere intellectual persuasion, because I don't believe we can be an effective army, an effective military, unless we refuse to accept these things. And that means we have to change the way we do business. I am heartened to know, as I have already said, that nearly everyone I talk to in the Pentagon, including the Army, generally agrees with me. General Iardi, our G8, has begun an accessions review, which is now carried on by others. General McConville and his team are furiously working on all of these matters, and they are supporting the Force of the Future working groups. Secretary Watta's staff is intertwined with my own. In my opinion, and for the moment mine alone, we have to move. We have to move from a world of up or out promotions with rigid timelines, limited time for broadening, incredible churn, barriers to moving between the active and reserve components and back again, in which we insist upon your retirement, upon your exit from military service in your 40s or 50s, a time when most people in the private sector are reaching the very peak of their powers. And instead, we have to move to a world in which the talents of each and every soldier, the skills, knowledge, and behaviors required for every job are well known, are mapped, and where we have the ability to match the demand for talent with the supply we recruit, retain, and develop. A world where we permit without prejudice the seamless moving from one component to another, and maybe from one service to another, according to the nation's needs, where we acknowledge that not everyone wants to be a general officer, and that individual contributors taken off the promotion treadmill can serve for years with greater and greater expertise. This is the force of the future. This is the force of the future, if not all by August 19th, the deadline set for me by Secretary Carter, then someday soon. Because what we have now is not what should be. It is not what must be. It is not what our service members and the country demands, if now those demands are heard only in hushed tones. For our personnel system is a mainframe in the age of PCs, a Polaroid in the time of digital cameras. Once the cutting edge, but now superseded. Still usable, but not optimal. Of passionate value, really, only to hobbyists and historians, lacking most of the features that are now, in most precincts, taken for granted as the bare minimum. I believe that the strength of the American military, and especially of the Army, is not our expensive kit, but our priceless human capital. And I believe we must have a personnel system worthy of our mission. On behalf of Secretary Carter, I am committed to achieving this. I hope you'll join me. because we need your help. So thank you for letting me come today. Thank you, General Sullivan, for the invitation, and I look forward to answering your questions as well.
Sir, that was very insightful and thought-provoking. Thank you. I'm sure there must be some questions. Anyone?
We have over here, General Thompson.
Wow. Those are obviously penetrating questions, and the answers are going to be difficult to come up with, I'm sure. Can you talk a little bit about two things? One would be you touched on it, I think your word was churn. Can you talk about how your analysis and review will treat the idea of sort of normal that, at least in the Army, people change stations every 2 or 3 years? And secondly, can you talk about the hacking that occurred in OPM? Is that going to affect, do you see that as affecting the willingness of people that you're describing as high talent, high potential, that we would like to get into the Department of Defense to do the great and wonderful things that they need to do? Do you see that happening as a negative happening as it relates to the recruitment of those high potential people?
Yes, we're all deeply concerned about the fact that our SF-86 are now seemingly in Beijing with all of the private information attended to it, from behavioral health history to marital records, things such as this. And will it hurt our recruiting? I don't know, because perhaps the expectation of privacy from either the government or when records are held by industry has so diminished over time that people aren't surprised by this. So I don't know the answer to that, although we're obviously deeply concerned about it, not only to the people who are victims of this hack, but whether it will inhibit us in the future from recruiting. So we're watching it closely. In terms of the churn, I speak only for myself again here. The working groups, the Force of the Future, this is a collaborative process. I cited General McConville many times in my talk. I don't think he agrees with everything I said there, although the spirit of what I spoke of there is something I think, if I can put words in your mouth, you're sympathetic to. You have a difficult job, worried about the practical aspects, the implementation of these issues in a way that, from my lofty perch at OSD, I could be a bit abstracted from. But the churn to me seems to be a real problem. It's a real problem for a couple of reasons. One of which is you do not have time to develop expertise in the job you're doing. In the Army, we pride ourselves on being generalists. We put people into jobs of which they have no real background for, but because we think they're great leaders, and they are, or they're competent at what they do, and they can pick up the skills on the job. They can do that, and they do it rather remarkably. But as soon as you're close to competence, we move you on to a new position or retire you altogether. That makes no sense. The broadening is important, but we have to make it deeper as well and allow people in important jobs who do it so very well to stay longer than we now permit them to do. We don't want to go back to a world like it was before World War II in the U.S. Army, where most of our leaders from the Army or the Army Air Force had been captains or lieutenant colonels for 20 years on a couple of occasions, as they waited for someone to die above them to open up a spot. That's when we went to the current system in 1947. But there are ways to select out each year those people who are not performing well at the 10-year, at the 20-year mark, 3 years thereafter, that will avoid that kind of cluttering at the top. So we have to allow people to do their job better. There's a second issue, though, that we should be aware of. The future of all of the services is in recruiting more knowledge workers. Whether you're an infantryman or whether you're involved in artillery and air defense or a million things in between of that, right? Your cognitive ability is going to be a more and more important factor in your success. So, as I mentioned, women are a problem for us because we don't recruit enough and women dominate in higher education today. But smart people increasingly marry other smart people. Right? The workforce has changed a lot over the last 75 years. No longer is it a male-dominated profession, well, not exclusively male profession, in which your wife was expected to follow you around from camp, post, and station. Today, smart people marry doctors and lawyers, and those doctors and lawyers have careers, and moving every 2 years is a hardship on them. And if we're going to keep the very people we want most to stay in, right, we have to let people stay in duty stations and in jobs longer than we do today. So not to do that is to me, as I often do when I go to business schools across the country, Harvard, Kellogg, etc. I meet Army veteran after Army veteran. And look, some of them wanted to get out. Many of them would say, like, I wanted to spend 4 or 5 years in the service. I never envisioned myself doing 20. We won't keep all of those people in, and we are grateful for their service. But I meet too many who say, you know, my wife is a doctor, and I wanted to stay in the National Capital Region where she could finish up her schooling. But instead, I was told I had to go to Korea. I was happy to go to Korea in 2 years, but I couldn't go right now. And so they separated. That story is one that's told too often, and that churn is part of the problem.
Any other questions?
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for this presentation. I got writer's cramp taking notes here. It would be interesting to get the statistics, have the opportunity to use them. I'm sure this study and this work group will produce this, but I'm wondering if there are any priorities in this work that are already starting to kind of present themselves, because the magnitude of what you're talking about is significant. Change in any one of these is going to be challenging, culturally, if not through regulations, laws, and things like that. So are there any priorities that are starting to suggest themselves that would have higher payoff earlier?
Sure, and they are just suggesting themselves. General Johnson, good to see you again. And they go to many of the questions I raised, that allowing people to stay longer in jobs, letting promotions, especially after the 03 level, be based on the acquisition of capabilities rather than on hitting 11 years or 17 years or 22 years, plus or minus a year for below zone or above the zone. Letting people take off ramps, where if you want to go get advanced civil schooling, or perhaps raise your children, right, that you can go into the reserve component, maybe as an active drilling reservist, maybe into the IRR, and come back and again not find your chances at promotion in any way inhibited. These are the kind of things that are suggesting themselves, and things that General McConville has already started initiating. We just a couple of weeks ago announced a career intermission program. He's pushing advanced civil schooling, and we have a cohort of people who are going to send off for graduate education. So these are the kind of things that are announcing themselves. A second issue that I only mentioned in passing is the IT-enabled matching of assignments with the right people. We've experimented with this in the Army, green pages for the Corps of Engineers. The Navy has a LinkedIn-style system today that they're working on. They're just emergent, really. But this idea that there's a matching of assignments. You know, Colonel Odie Sheffield is back here. He works in my office at PNR. He can remember a time, he said, when he was down at Fort Benning, where you could go and there would be a board where people put notes on there, and they would say, like, hey, you know, I'm supposed to go to Korea. I'll give you $10,000 plus my Jeep to go to Germany, right? I'm sure others in this room can remember that world well. And he would say that elaborate trades would start, 3- or 4-way swaps, perhaps, to get into the right spot. That's an informal market that developed organically. We should enable that through IT to make it better, where that doctor married to the young officer, she's in med school, right, can find a way to say, hey, there are lots of people who want to go to Korea, who love it there, you know, who think this is the right move for them. And instead they're being sent off to Fort Riley or to Fort Belvoir or to the Pentagon, for God's sake. And there would be an easy trade for them to make. So this IT-enabled job matching is part of it. That's going to be not as difficult to implement as one might think, but as a cultural change for us that General McConville and others will have to work out the implications for. But they're already thinking through. The new Enterprise Resource Program, IPSA, as it's known in the Army, through modules by PeopleSoft, can do much of this kind of work. And so it's about kind of putting the rules around it that govern it. So those are the things that are suggesting themselves from the working group. Ray, I know you had a question as well. The microphone is coming your way.
You've thrown a very wide net to gather both analytic capability and observations, suggestions to truly bring us into the 21st century with respect to the future force. You also made reference briefly to reaching outside of the Department of Defense, even outside, excuse me, of government. So far, have you considered any of the major private corporations? You mentioned a couple of them, both in the high-tech area and the traditional non-high-tech area. Are there any models that you have come across in the private sector, corporate private sector, that might lend themselves, granted, the United States Army, the United States military is a different institution, that might have traction here in your study?
Yes, every major corporation in America today does it differently than we do. Every one of them does. I mean, you can talk to, yes, the high-tech companies from Silicon Valley. We talk to industrial companies, one of practically ancient provenance in the business world, the Procters & Gambles, the General Electrics, right? They do it differently than we do. Let me give you an example of this, just one illustration of a source of frustration. If I go to every service in the department, and I say, tell me how you identify your top 10% of your talent. This question can flummox people, right? It flummoxes many people. In fact, not from the Army, but from other services, I've had people come back, people in the highest levels of the personnel world say, well, I don't know what you're talking about when you say talent. How do you go about defining talent? And I want to say, this is exactly the problem, right? If you go to GE, if you go to Google, and every company in between, they know what talent means. It's about knowledge, skills, behaviors. They identify it early. They groom it, both through internal corporate education and sending people who are necessary to the outside world. They put them on the fast track. They get them under the right leaders. They give them chances to show their own leadership. We ourselves have a hard time saying, hey, who's the top 10%? Who's the top 20%? Right? We try to do some efforts at this in the Army, at Human Resources Command, where we have some kind of informal management. But this is not enough. And I want to give credit to the Army, to the G1 and their team. We have done more than any other service in thinking through about what talent management really means. We now know, but this is a new thing for us, what skills it takes to be an infantryman, or in signal, or in finance, or in ordnance. Right? What are we looking for here? Are we looking for general cognitive ability, an IQ test? Not always. Maybe we're looking for kind of logical or spatial thinking. Maybe we're looking for emotional intelligence or the ability to communicate well. Maybe physical fitness is a premium, as it is in the infantry, but maybe not in finance. Trying to map what the talents are required for a branch. Something they're doing well at West Point, they're going to extend to ROTC. And we wouldn't do it without General McConville's great leadership in helping push these things through. So we have a better sense in the Army than any other service does about what talent means. But we still don't know which officer has the best logico-spatial ability in the U.S. Army. Who is that person, right? We don't know that. We don't know, and we don't really track, right, even who the highest cognitive performers are in the U.S. Army, by SAT scores, by in the enlisted ranks AFQT. We don't track these things over time, right? We collect lots of data. We have a certain mania for quantitative calculation in the Army, but it's never assimilated in a way that we can use it. And so, again, we are a people business, in the Army most of all, and the Marine Corps too, but the other services also. And the fact that we do not engage in the kind of most basic talent management practices that are, again, the bare minimum in the private sector today is just something that we shouldn't let stand. We shouldn't let stand. So I think everyone does it better than we do in that sense. We have so many admirable things we do well. When it comes to this talent management question, we are complacent about a system that once served us well, but in the information age, in the 21st century, right, has become outmoded. Sir.
Get the mic here. At one point, didn't ARI, Army Research Institute, for those who ARI kind of died, but is it still alive and well?
Yes, Michelle Sams does a wonderful job.
Didn't we do some screening at one point, specifically interviewing people who were deemed to be high quality on some
The
interview
TAPAS test,
scale?
yes.
What happened to all of that
We
stuff?
still do that. We still do that. And Michelle Sams does a great job leading ARI. And the TAPAS test is administered to enlisted personnel and is an attempt to measure kind of behavioral characteristics, right, that we think track with your ability to make it through training, make it through your first assignment. And it's proven quite successful, and we still use it to screen in or screen out people who might otherwise qualify for service. So if you are in the bottom half of the AFQT distribution, where we don't, where we're unsure of the merits of your entry, the TAPAS can say, hey, this is a particularly resilient person, right? This is someone who has all of the non-cognitive skills for success. So it is still being used. It's still being, and the other services are interested in it or have a different version of it. So the future is going to be, as you saw from the Time magazine cover this week about Know Your XQ, they called it, the use of these non-cognitive tests to allow us to better manage talent and understand kind of what people bring to the fight. So yes, ARI is still more than vital, and TAPAS is still a program we use successfully.
Thanks.
As well. I see one in the back.
Mike Schneider, Temis Computer. I applaud all of these efforts to strengthen our personnel system in the Army. I'm a 30-year survivor of it, reasonably well, I would say. And I appreciate, like I said, I empathize with every one of those questions that you asked. My concern really is, though, that first and foremost, the Army is a profession, and the personnel system is inextricably entwined with strengthening that profession. And I didn't hear anything in your remarks acknowledging that and really asking those questions in context of how it is that whatever we end up doing is going to result in strengthening of the profession. Can you speak to that, please?
No, sure. The profession of arms is, as Douglas MacArthur called it, a profession. Absolutely. Chairman Dempsey often reminds me of that when I talk about personnel systems, and it's worth acknowledging that today as well. We have an important mission, an existential mission, to protect the country, to protect the lives of the people who live in this nation. So yes, all of this must be in the context of our goal of producing sustainable, ready combat forces. That's the business that we're in at DoD, right? That's what we do, provide sustainable, ready combat forces. And it is a profession, and I am more than aware of the notion that it can be broken by mistaken policies. That's why I commiserate deeply with General McConville's task. He has a hard job, and the hard job is because we have to go differently. We have to do something else, and moving there is not an easy thing to do. You know, I'm reminded, the example I often give, right, we all go to our computers this afternoon and we type on a keyboard that has this odd configuration of letters, Q, W, E, R, T, Y across the top. There's no real reason for them to be that way. It harkens back to the earliest days of typewriters, of course. They tried to space out letters where they wouldn't all, the hammers jam at the same time by letters that occur in the English language too frequently side by side. But we all learned upon it, even though we no longer worry about that particular technical problem. And to move away from the QWERTY keyboard to ones that experts would say would all allow us to type more words per minute, right, is just to abandon decades of practice. Well, the personnel system is not too different from that in some ways. I think even people who are perhaps more cautious than I, even those who might be critical of some of the things I've said today, would say we wouldn't do the same system we have today if we were inventing the U.S. military all over again. But we have what we have, right, and we must learn to live with it and fix it on the margins. I'm interested in that idea. I contemplate it a lot. I know I say it is wrong. But I do say, also think about another imperative, which is there is a revolution in human resources going on out there, and we are not taking part in it. And I am more than open to say the system can work well as it is today, because we need to maintain the profession of arms. But when I ask the questions which I've posed today, so I'm in this Q&A period, like who are the best Army officers? What jobs require this particular talent? What enlisted and officer cohort in the U.S. military has these the most? We cannot answer that question. We cannot answer that question. So no matter what personnel system we have, whether we keep this web of DOPMA-inspired up or out promotion systems with temporal benchmarks, we have to know our people better. We have to know our people better. And I said, and that imperative in no way conflicts with perhaps the more edgy notions that I've talked about here today or that I answered in response to General Thompson. We have to know our people better. We don't. We're starting this at West Point, extending it to the ROTC community. It perhaps will change over time, but it's only happened through the, again, efforts of people like General McConville, General Bromberg before him, and visionary G1s who've kind of foisted these on us. So we have to know our people better. That's what this is about, knowing our people better and managing them. And I don't believe that's inconsistent with the profession of arms and the sacred duty that the Army and the other services have. So.
Sir, CW5 Phyllis Wilson, Command Chief of the Army Reserve. So, excuse me, two things. First, when you were saying that 6% of new recruits have a mom that has served in the service, well, I may have squandered those numbers a bit because I have 4 sons that are
Terrific.
have all come into the
Congratulations.
services.
Thank
so
you.
We're skewing that data set a little bit. But as we talk about the integrated pay and personnel system for the Army and how that's being rolled out, certainly within the Guard and Reserve, the Reserve components, we have very different, as you said, a myriad of personnel and pay systems out there, and how we're now trying to roll these all into one. But from the personnel side, exactly what you're speaking to is how do we make sure that as we morph the IPSA process over the next coming years to ensure that we actually can dumpster dive, if you will, when we want to pull some data threads out to find people with key skill sets, key capabilities, or that critical thinking aspect. How are we going to be able to input that data so that we can then extrapolate it back out? Thanks.
Well, we have databases today that need to be brought in, but it has to be a pull too. I mean, if I want to know more about you, Chief, do I go look at your military Army record, or do I go to LinkedIn? Right? I'll learn more about you from LinkedIn, as is true. I'm connected with probably many people in this room. If I want to know about you, I go there first. If I want to know about an Army officer, I don't go to their ORB. I go to LinkedIn to read about them. Because it has everything that's on the ORB, minus the code and the shorthand and the things that people who aren't professional readers of these things, right, that we struggle with. And it tells many more things. Your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, not only your vocation, but your avocations, right? The things that you traveled to. You know, maybe you're married, maybe not. These are the things that I learn about you. And people, again, my information and your information isn't dragged into LinkedIn. We put it there because we realize it has merit for us. People who have jobs will find me. My friends will find me. So that's how the system has to work. If we tell people, hey, you put information in here that you took a trip to Kenya with your family, right, or you had orders to Kenya for a few months, or that you learned Swahili on the side just because you have a keen intellectual interest in African affairs, right, that information has to be inputted, and it has to be put in there by the soldier himself or herself, because they know that when the AFRICOM commander is looking for someone with some Kenyan expertise who might be able to speak Swahili, that they'll be searching and they'll find you. Find a field where you enter that kind of information. So it's a push-pull is how you get that data in. IPSA will no doubt track all of the long-standing personnel databases, but right, the information's fuzzy. There's a lot of noise to signal in it. It's not that usable sometimes. It doesn't have all the interesting things we want in it. So we need to tell people there's a market out there for your talent. Right? Enter what you like, and people will find you. And that's how you get it done. Robin.
Hey, sir, first off, I have a sheet of paper coming for you today. I really need you to sign it. This question is, gets back to your opening comments. Secretary McHugh has had a wonderful tenure, hasn't he? Going on 7 years, I think?
Yes.
Secretary Spears here today, and if we include the time as ASA, FMNC, as well as his time as a PDASA, I mean, his clock is, he's in the long in the tooth category. Both of those gentlemen are really the exceptions rather than the rule on the political side. So just interested to know if your study will also take a look and make recommendations back to Secretary Carter for over at the White House. Leadership on the civilian side to take specific actions and then have the legs to see those actions through from the civilian side. Will your study make any recommendations in that regard?
Yes, not perhaps so much about political appointees, but they illustrate the point, which is Secretary Mabus in the Navy, Secretary McHugh in the Army, people like Bob Spear. Tenure allows you to get things done, right? Allows you to push initiatives, be available to see the consequences. So, hey, if this is a bad idea, right, you'll live to pick it up, as well as to kind of do all of the second and third order matters that take for successful realization of a project. So keeping people in these political jobs longer is a very important thing. The same churn that hurts the Army staff that I mentioned and the Army in general on the uniform side affects the civilian world as well. So you'll see recommendations about that. The civilian personnel reforms, which we talked about less today because we are at AUSA after all, are an equally important part of this project. In some ways, they are more tractable, but they're harder to realize because it's a whole of government effort. Right? Our civilian workforce is part of a system that OPM oversees and that the White House has a keen interest in. And so when you make a change to DOD's personnel system on the civilian side, right, you affect lots of other people. All right, the military personnel system is one that we own ourselves. And that if the DOD, with our friends in Congress, can agree about it, we can do something. But in all these jobs, longer tenure is really important. And so for the next president, right, finding people who can be in these jobs for 4 years plus, I think is a really important thing because it takes a long time. The Army, just the Army, is a complicated institution, enormously complicated, one that befuddles people at our level who've been in the Army for 30 years, which is how long you've been in by the time you make it up to the E-ring. So to come in from the outside for a year or two and think you understand anything about it is an illusion.
Sir, we just have one or two more for you.
Hello, sir. Joe Gould from Defense News. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
So I guess my question is, to what degree are you going to require any kind of congressional action here, and in what way does this dovetail with military compensation reform efforts? Thank you.
Let me start with your last part of that question. It dovetails closely with military compensation reform. Because when you talk about a personnel system, how you compensate people must be an integral part of that discussion. And moving to a blended retirement, as the department has now proposed following on the Benefits Commission, is a right way to do that. I mentioned that one of my concerns about the existing personnel system is its inequity. One of the reasons is that 83% of people who join the military don't stick around for 20 years to enjoy the defined benefit retirement. The idea that we can let people come in and serve for a few years and then leave with something is a very important matter of justice for the service member, but also gives us a force shaping tool that we don't have today. Right now, our force shaping tools can really only be turned to the right. We don't have to grow the force. But in times of downsizing or shaping, right, we struggle more. It's a difficult thing. And so using defined contribution plans to shape the force in a better way is really important. If we want to encourage longer tenure in jobs, we want people to stay in the services longer, not get out at 20 years, but stay to 30 years or more than that. Right? The compensation system is part of that. You know, I could talk about other issues that will be part of what Force the Future, I hope, speaks to. You know, why is it that across the services, right, the major pay increases occur at, say, years 2 and 3 of your time, right? Those are not the moments we're worried about retention. That's at years 4 and 5, maybe years 8 to 10. If you make it 8 to 10, you're likely to stay to 20, right? So why is it that our big pay increases are at times when people are not on the razor's edge of staying in or out? So all of these kind of compensation questions, from basic pay to benefits to retirement, right, have to be part of the discussion. A personnel system necessarily implicates them. In terms of what kind of congressional action, I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure what the final recommendations will be. DOPMA, the term I think I used earlier in response to a question, right, the Defense Officer Promotion Management Act from 1980, is in Title 10. It's also enforced through a variety of DODs and DOD directives. And so there's going to have to be kind of a regulatory legislative change if we want to talk about up or out promotions, these kind of things. And so it's likely that there'll be some legislative activity required.
Sir, thank you. The all-volunteer force, as you know, been in effect for
4 decades, 40 years. Some great things, our quality force, the soldiers are off the charts in terms of quality. One of the challenges is the disconnect between the civilian sector of the population and the military sector. 1% sort of in the military, the rest, you don't have to join a Rotary Club if you don't want to. What kind of forcing functions, I would call it, that the legislative branch of government or executive branch of government could do to try and bridge that gap? Certainly with the National Guard, with an armory in every town is one way and is in being now, but are there some other things, if we've got this talent challenge, especially with the sessions, that would help that?
I don't have good answers for you. The reserve component is a key part of this because they are out in every state and all the towns. And for many people, it's what they know about the U.S. Army, for example, as our installations are increasingly concentrated in 5 states. So for 45 states, right, the Guard and people who drill on the weekends as reservists are what they think about in the U.S. Army. So that's a key role for that. I mean, your question obliquely raises this notion of propensity to serve, which is of great concern to me. I mentioned that we think only about 400,000 young people each year have a propensity to serve who might be eligible, and we have to recruit 2/3 of them into the military. That's a tall order. So the challenge for us is to encourage more people to want to serve their country. We have to increase that pool because we already see this in the Army, where meeting mission for recruiting in both the RC and the AC is a challenge for us, a difficult challenge for us now that, again, General McConville is working on with his team. We have to increase the propensity to serve. How do we do that? I don't know. Whether it's joint marketing, which is one of the things that we're actually looking at in Force of the Future, to say, hey, join the military, learn more about it, because underneath my purview at PNR, we have the Joint Marketing Research Service, JAMRS, and their data is kind of startling, right? That most people can't even name a single military service. Maybe like the Army, but is the Army different than the Marine Corps? They're not really sure of these kind of things. It's kind of the basic ignorance about the work that's so important and that we take as just kind of secondhand, right? We've lived it, and so I said increasingly our mothers and fathers lived it too. Right? It can't be taken for granted any longer. And so some kind of joint marketing effort is really important. So I don't know the answer to all of those questions, but it's a great concern to me that, and it was really what the second question was about. It's a family business. You join because your father was in it, your mother was in it. General McConville has 2 boys in the U.S. Army today, right? That is a story, sort of great nobility, really, right, about what families believe in. But it's a diverse country out there, and we have to do better. And maybe part of it is a challenge, again, I know that the G1 works on, and we think about in the senior Army leadership, right? Recruiting in new places. If you go to Los Angeles, you go to Chicago, right? The number of recruiting stations in those cities of multiple millions, some of the largest cities in the world, right? Right, there are fewer ROTC detachments than you have in the state of Alabama, for example, in both LA and Chicago. I mean, I don't know how you get around that, right? That's a hard problem, easy to talk about, harder to do something about, but that's what we have to do, right? The demographics of this country are shifting, right? We have 5% of U.S. Army officers are Latino. That's a growing ethnic group in this country, right? We have to find ways, like the Marine Corps actually has been somewhat successful in, right, in recruiting more Latinos and going to new places. Again, I don't know, but those are the challenges. That's why I am being honest when I say to you today, the questions I raised, what we've talked about here, I don't have answers for them, but they're questions that we have to brood about for a long time.
That was a great presentation, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's give Secretary Carson a big round of applause.